My name is Carmen Ellis, and if there's one thing I learned the hard way, it's that some families don't just play favorites, they build their entire world around one child and expect the other to silently fold until there's nothing left. I never imagined my wedding would be the thing that cracked everything open. When I got engaged, my parents didn't congratulate me, they warned me. They said money was tight, that I needed to be realistic, that a simple backyard ceremony was all they could handle. And by simple, they meant a borrowed yard plastic chairs, a Bluetooth speaker, and zero support. I agreed not because I wanted to, but because I was tired of being the one who always made things easier for everyone else. But one night, while reviewing a basic design mock-up for my cheap invitation cards, an email slid into my inbox. An invoice. A very long, very detailed invoice. A $33,000 luxury honeymoon package. First-class flights, Italy, boutique hotels, private tours, all paid for by my parents. Not for me, for someone else. I stared at the screen until the numbers blurred. In that moment, something inside me didn't just sting, it settled. The wedding they pushed on me had nothing to do with money. It had everything to do with reminding me where I ranked in this family. And that was the moment I stopped pretending I didn't see it. Before I tell you how everything unfolded and how I ended up holding my real wedding without them, make sure you subscribe, tap like, and share your thoughts as we go. What happened next was nothing short of explosive. Growing up, certain moments stood out more sharply than I realized. When I was younger, it became clear that Maddox Ellis was the child my parents naturally revolved around, even though they never said it out loud. At school, she always had the newest backpack, the upgraded graphing calculator, the club fees paid without hesitation. When she joined dance class, they bought her custom shoes and private lessons. Meanwhile, I pieced together whatever supplies were left on clearance shelves and learned early how to make do with whatever I had. Birthdays made the difference even more obvious. Maddox got themed parties, rented bounce houses, and cake designs ordered weeks in advance. Mine usually involved a homemade sheet cake and a reminder to not expect too much this year. I didn't complain, partly because I was used to it, and partly because any attempt to point it out was brushed aside with, "You're the easy one, Carmen. Your sister needs more support." The older we grew, the clearer that pattern became. One summer, I had been promised a spot in an enrichment program at the community college, something I was genuinely excited about. It wasn't glamorous, but it meant a chance to learn graphic design, something I had begged to try for years. I remember sitting at the kitchen table filling out the final form when my mother casually mentioned that I wouldn't be attending after all. They had used the tuition money to buy Maddox a new laptop because her old one wasn't running fast enough. I didn't understand how a program I'd prepared for all school year suddenly didn't matter, but the disappointment settled the way all disappointments eventually did, with a quiet acceptance. Maddox always had someone smoothing the path in front of her. I always figured out my own way through it. By the time we reached adulthood, the gap was so normal nobody acknowledged it anymore. When I announced that I was engaged, I hadn't expected fireworks, but a small part of me hoped I'd at least get a moment where my parents looked at me the way they looked at Maddox every time she accomplished something. Instead, my mother barely finished hearing the news before she said, "You should keep it small, sweetheart. Something simple fits you better." The words hit harder than they should have, mostly because of how casually she said them. Not cruelly, not intentionally. Just matter of fact, as if it were obvious that my wedding didn't need attention planning or excitement. Maddox could have a full production in Sedona, but I needed to be practical. I tried to brush it off, tried to pretend I didn't hear the implication buried under her tone, but it lingered in the back of my mind like a bruise. Later that night, after the house was quiet and Ethan had fallen asleep, I sat on the edge of the bed with the honeymoon invoice glowing on my phone. The total $33,000 stared back at me like a reminder I'd been avoiding my entire life. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't a slip-up. It was a pattern. One I had been living in for so long that it took seeing that number to realize just how deeply it ran. A few weeks later, everything shifted again. Maddox announced her engagement to Kyle Benjamin, and the news spread through our family group chat faster than I could even process it. My phone kept lighting up with emojis, exclamation marks, and excited messages from relatives I hadn't heard from in months. By dinner, my parents insisted everyone gather at their house to properly celebrate the big moment. When Ethan and I arrived, the atmosphere was completely different from the muted response we'd gotten when we shared our engagement. The dining table was already set with their best dishes, candles lit, and a chilled bottle of champagne waiting at the center. The moment Maddox walked in, our parents practically beamed. My dad popped the champagne with a flourish, and everyone clapped while the bubbles spilled over the rim. They poured glasses around the table, toasting to Maddox and Kyle's future, discussing how perfect they were together, as if this had been destiny written years ago. I sat quietly beside Ethan, my fingers intertwined with his under the table, trying not to let the contrast punch me in the chest. The conversation quickly shifted to wedding planning, real wedding planning. My mom leaned forward with excitement, saying she had already booked a preliminary tour at a luxury venue in Sedona because she thought it would fit the elegance Maddox deserves. My sister lit up, describing a designer gown she had tried on earlier that week, adding that our mom wanted to pay for it because a moment like this only happens once. No one asked me anything. Not about my plans. Not about how my own wedding preparations were going, not even whether I felt okay with the sudden spectacle happening right in front of me. It was as if my engagement simply didn't exist in the room. Maddox kept scrolling through her phone, showing my parents' inspiration photos, floral arches, string quartets, sunset ceremonies, with each picture earning more enthusiastic approval than the last. My mother praised the idea of custom invitations and handwritten calligraphy, things she dismissed as unnecessary extravagance when I mentioned anything remotely similar. Ethan squeezed my hand under the table, his thumb brushing the inside of my palm in a small gesture that told me he saw exactly what I was seeing. The imbalance wasn't subtle. It was overwhelming. The room buzzed with joy, but it was a joy I wasn't part of. I tried to focus on my breathing, tried to be happy for my sister in a way that didn't crush my own feelings. But then, as the plates were being cleared, my father leaned back in his chair and said loud enough for the whole table to hear, "Maddox deserves a proper wedding. Something meaningful. Not one of those small makeshift things." Someone chuckled. Someone else agreed. And then he added almost casually, "Some weddings are better kept simple anyway. It's just easier that way." He didn't say my name. He didn't have to. Every word landed exactly where it was meant to. A quiet evening a few days later gave me the chance to catch up on the small, inexpensive tasks my mother had insisted I handle myself. One of them was checking the updated mock-up for the bargain invitation cards she said were perfectly fine for what I needed. I opened my laptop, ready to approve the design, when another email slipped into my inbox. At first, I thought it was a duplicate of the message I had seen weeks earlier, but the subject line was slightly different, and curiosity forced me to click it. The invoice for the Italy honeymoon appeared again, itemized, pristine, unmistakable. $33,000. I stared at the screen, feeling the numbers press into me like a weight. It wasn't a glitch. Someone had forwarded it again. I scrolled to the bottom and saw the agency's signature block. Without thinking, I grabbed my phone and called the travel agency listed on the document. A polite woman answered, and I gave her the invoice number, pretending to be confirming a detail on behalf of a family member. She pulled it up immediately. When she said the names of the payees, Patricia and Philip Ellis, I felt something inside me settle in a way I couldn't ignore anymore. My parents paid for it. Fully. Without hesitation. The agent added that the trip had been booked weeks ago, locked in with upgrades, tours, and a private villa. Her voice was cheerful, as if she expected me to share the excitement. I thanked her, hung up, and let the silence of the room close around me. It was one thing to suspect favoritism. It was another to confirm it in a way that erased any possibility of misunderstanding. Maddox wasn't just being supported. She was being elevated, celebrated, polished like something precious. I was being managed, contained, minimized. A wedding in their eyes was a financial burden when it belonged to me, but a grand investment when it belonged to her. I needed proof not for them, but for myself, so that I wouldn't later convince my own mind that I was exaggerating. So I began saving everything: screenshots of group chats, voicemails where my mother said things like, "Don't complicate it, Carmen," messages from relatives asking about Maddox's venue search, receipts, dates. I tucked every piece into a hidden folder on my laptop methodically, as if documenting a case file I wished I didn't need. Ethan came home halfway through, immediately noticing the tension in my shoulders. When I showed him the invoice and told him what the travel agency confirmed, he didn't raise his voice or curse. He just exhaled slow and measured the kind of breath someone takes when they're trying to keep their anger from spilling over. Then he said quietly, "This is the last straw. You don't deserve this." Hearing it from someone outside my family made it feel real in a way I had resisted acknowledging. I closed the invoice again and sat there for a long moment, letting the truth settle. They didn't see me. Not really. Not equally. And they never had. It was in that stillness, with Ethan's hand resting over mine, that I made a decision I hadn't been brave enough to make before. I would have a real wedding, one that reflected my life, my relationship, my worth. And they wouldn't know a thing about it. The next morning, I knew I needed a plan that didn't involve waiting for my parents to suddenly treat me differently, so I started looking for venues that fit our budget and felt like somewhere I'd actually want to get married. After hours of scrolling through listings, emailing coordinators, and crossing off places that were either booked out or outrageously expensive, I stumbled onto a small lakeside option near Canyon Lake. The photos were simple but beautiful: wooden railings, open space, and a quiet view that felt honest in a way nothing else had. I called immediately, half expecting to be told they were full for the season. Instead, a warm, older voice answered and introduced herself as the owner. She told me they had exactly one slot left, the very last one available, and if I wanted it, she could hold it long enough for me to come see the space. Ethan and I drove out that afternoon. The owner greeted us like she had known us forever, showing us around with a kind of gentle enthusiasm that made me feel something I hadn't felt in weeks wanted. When she learned we were planning the wedding on our own, she offered advice, recommended vendors who charged fair prices, and even said she'd waive a small fee if it helped us stay within budget. It felt like the universe finally gave me one small break. Once the date was secured, Ethan reached out to a friend who did part-time photography on weekends. He agreed to shoot the whole wedding for a price that didn't make my stomach clench. My friends stepped in without hesitation. One offered to build a wooden arch by hand, saying he had leftover lumber from a home project. Another had access to wholesale dried flowers and said she'd put together bouquets and table arrangements. Someone else found a rental company willing to provide chairs and simple decor pieces at a discount. For the first time in my life, I felt surrounded by people who wanted to make something special for me, not out of obligation, not out of comparison, but out of genuine care. I created a detailed checklist on my laptop, organizing everything by week. And then I did something that felt both strategic and strangely liberating. I hid every trace of it. I deleted email notifications, cleared search history, renamed folders, and used a private drive for contracts and receipts. I couldn't risk even a hint reaching my family. Meanwhile, the group chat kept lighting up with photos and updates from my parents and Maddox, all of them preparing the backyard ceremony they assumed we were still having. They sent pictures of folding tables, bulk flowers from a warehouse, plastic cutlery, and mismatched decorations. Maddox chimed in repeatedly, giving instructions as if she were directing a full production. One picture in particular froze me for a moment, a row of cheap white plastic chairs lined up crookedly in the afternoon sun. Maddox stood beside them, pointing clearly, telling someone where to move them. I stared at that image longer than I expected, and instead of guilt, all I felt was clarity. If I had ever doubted whether keeping my real wedding secret was the right choice, that single photo erased the hesitation completely. The morning of the wedding arrived with a strange sense of calm, the kind that settles in when you know exactly what you're doing and why you're doing it. As I finished pinning the last piece of my hair in place, my phone buzzed on the counter. It was a message from my mother. "Don't be late, sweetheart. Guests are already starting to show up." I read it once, let the words sink in for a moment, and then quietly turned my phone face down, silencing the screen entirely. There was nothing left to say. Ethan met my eyes in the mirror and gave me a small, steady smile before taking my hand and leading me outside to where our friends were waiting. The photographer lifted his camera, the breeze swept gently across the water, and for the first time in a long time, everything felt like it was exactly where it needed to be. The ceremony began. I walked toward Ethan, surrounded by people who actually cared about us, and every step felt like shedding a layer of something heavy. When we exchanged vows, my voice wavered not from uncertainty, but from how deeply right the moment felt. I saw tears in the eyes of friends who had watched me fight to be seen and valued. Ethan's hands trembled slightly as he held mine, the camera clicked softly around us, and the world seemed to narrow down to nothing but the two of us standing by the lake, finally choosing ourselves. Meanwhile, several miles away in Phoenix, a very different scene was unfolding. Guests trickled into the backyard confused as they looked around at the folding tables, the uneven rows of plastic chairs, and the chaotic attempts to decorate. Maddox moved around in a rush, pointing at centerpieces, adjusting tablecloths, and snapping instructions at anyone who paused too long. My parents floated anxiously between clusters of people, apologizing for the heat and muttering about how Carmen must be running behind. No one questioned it yet, not fully. They simply assumed I was doing what they always expected me to do: accommodate, adjust, bend. Back at Canyon Lake, Ethan slid a ring onto my finger, and when he said, "I choose you," I felt something inside me anchor. The photographer circled us, capturing every soft laugh, every hug from friends, every bit of joy that didn't need permission to exist. At the same time, messages were popping up in the family group chat asking where we were. Maddox continued pacing, trying to keep the increasingly restless guests entertained, while my parents whispered frustrations to each other about my lack of responsibility. But none of it reached me. None of it mattered. After the ceremony, Ethan wrapped his arm around my waist as we walked toward the small reception area our friends had put together. The music started, and for a moment it felt like the world was holding its breath just for us. Ethan leaned in close, his lips brushing my ear as he whispered, "They have no idea." A quiet, certain truth settled between us. And he was right. They didn't know. Not yet. As the reception at Canyon Lake settled into its warm, glowing rhythm, the music shifted to a slower song, and friends pulled us into hugs, laughter, and congratulations. For the first time all day, I stepped aside and reached into my bag to check my phone. The screen lit up with a wall of unread notifications, but I ignored them and opened the one thing I had been waiting for: the final 1-minute teaser from the photographer. The video was polished, crisp, and breathtaking drone shots gliding over the lake, the soft focus clips of our vows, the exact moment Ethan brushed away a tear, the applause that surged right after our kiss. It was everything my family insisted I wasn't worthy of having. Without hesitating, I tapped share, selected the family group chat, and dropped the link. No caption, no explanation. Just the truth in its purest, most cinematic form. Then I locked the phone and slipped it back into my purse. A few seconds later, curiosity tugged at me and I checked again. Every message showed the same thing seen. Not a single reply. No shocked emojis. No frantic questions. No excuses. Just silence so heavy it almost felt like a reaction in itself. I put the phone away again, unwilling to let their silence touch what was unfolding around me. But my brief peace didn't last long. The screen lit up over and over. My father started calling, the vibration pulsing against the table with a kind of urgency he had never used for me before. Then came the long, panicked messages from my mother, sentences spilling into each other as she demanded an explanation, insisting it must be a misunderstanding, begging me to call her back. After that, another notification popped up. Maddox had posted a status online. Some people are ungrateful. No name, no tag. But everyone who read it would know exactly whom she meant. I stared at the screen for a second, not out of hurt, but because of how predictable it all was. They weren't angry because they cared about my milestones. They were angry because they weren't the center of them. I dropped the phone back into my bag, zipped it shut, and walked straight into the middle of the dance floor where Ethan was waiting with his hand out. The DJ switched to an upbeat track, and friends cheered as Ethan pulled me close. My father's calls kept buzzing, but I didn't look back. The world around us felt bright. Loud, real, everything my old life had never allowed me to have. As the music swelled, Ethan leaned close, his voice soft enough for only me to hear. I rested my head against his shoulder, letting the last remnants of the past loosen their grip. From here, I whispered to him, I choose the family we build. The days that followed carried a quiet clarity I hadn't felt in years. The teaser circulated among relatives faster than anything my family had ever shared about me, and soon messages began coming from cousins, aunts, and even distant uncles who had never taken an interest before. They apologized for never noticing the imbalance, admitting that the video made everything impossible to deny. Several of them confronted Maddox, directly asking why she accepted an extravagant honeymoon while dismissing my wedding as something that should be simple. Kyle, caught in the middle of the question, stumbled through half-answers, clearly realizing he had walked into a version of Maddox that wasn't as charming as she always claimed. At home, my parents switched tactics every few hours. First came pleading long paragraphs about family unity, regrets, and promises to fix everything if you just talk to us. When I didn't respond, the tone shifted to blame, accusing me of humiliating them and creating drama. When that didn't work either, their messages slowed, then thinned, then stopped. The absence felt sharper than the noise ever had, but it also felt honest. I finally sat down at my laptop and drafted a message I had rehearsed a dozen times in my head. I kept it short, formal, and firm. From this point forward, all communication will be through email. I need clear boundaries, and this is the format I am comfortable with. I hit send, closed the laptop, and felt something inside me settle. A week later, Ethan and I packed the last box into his car and drove to Chandler, where we signed the lease for a small but sunlit place of our own. We spent the first evening unpacking while music played softly in the background, the kind of ordinary peace I used to watch other people have, and wonder if it was ever meant for me. Sitting on the floor beside the half-open boxes, I realized I wasn't grieving the distance with my family. I was grieving the years I had spent trying to earn something that was never offered freely. Those years were over, and I wasn't going back. The lesson revealed itself slowly but unmistakably. Love that demands you shrink is not love, it's control. And affection that hinges on your silence is not affection, it's exploitation. The truth was simple: family ties cannot survive on one-sided sacrifice. You don't owe anyone the version of yourself that keeps them comfortable while keeping you small. And stepping away isn't betrayal. Sometimes it's the clearest form of self-respect. As I looked around our new home, still cluttered but ours entirely, I felt a deep certainty that I had chosen the right path. Ethan wrapped his arm around me, and for the first time in a long time, the future felt wide open. Thank you for staying with me until the end of this story. Your time, your thoughts, and your comments mean more than you know. If this story resonated with you or reminded you of your own journey, I'd love to hear it. And if you'd like to join me for more stories like this, please consider subscribing. Your support helps this channel grow, and I truly appreciate every single one of you.